Hey, have you ever stopped to think about Guantanamo Bay?
Yeah.
I mean, the name itself carries so much weight.
Oh, absolutely.
You're
Yeah.
probably picture it as this place for, terrorism suspects. But get this. There's a recent memo that suggests it's also being used to detain migrants.
It kind of makes you do a double take.
It really does. For so long, Guantanamo has been this symbol of post-9/11 security focused on a very, very specific type of detainee.
Yeah.
So the idea that its role is expanding to include migrants, some of whom, well, they might not have any serious criminal history,
Yeah.
it definitely opens up a whole can of worms.
Yeah.
And some really important questions about how we're approaching immigration.
Exactly. And that's precisely what we wanted to dive into today. We got our hands on a memo that CBS News managed to obtain, and their reporting has been super insightful. In terms of understanding who could actually be sent to Guantanamo for immigration stuff. Turns out it might not be the image of the worst that, some people initially had in their heads.
So our mission today is pretty straightforward.
Hmm?
Let's really break down what this memo says and try to understand what it means for migrants.
And it's interesting, if you think back to when this idea first surfaced, there was a lot of talk about sending high-priority criminal aliens to Guantanamo.
Right.
The picture that was painted was of really serious criminals, individuals posing significant threats. That was the narrative.
Yeah, the former president even mentioned sending the worst migrants there. You're picturing dangerous offenders, right?
Yeah.
Like really dangerous.
Absolutely. But here's where the details get really interesting. This memo, it's an agreement between the Department of Homeland Security, DHS, and the Department of Defense, DOD.
Okay.
And it was signed back in March. It actually lays out some pretty broad criteria, and they don't necessarily depend on someone having a history of serious crime.
Wait, so not necessarily serious criminals?
Not necessarily. What's fascinating here is the key thing that could trigger a transfer to Guantanamo. The memo talks about migrants who have final deportation orders and, this is the crucial part, who have a nexus to a transnational criminal organization, TCO, or criminal drug activity.
Okay, a nexus. That still sounds kind of serious, maybe. Like connected to organized crime?
Well, when you first hear that, it might still sound like we're talking about significant threats, but it's the definition of nexus where things get really broad.
Ah, okay. How so?
Well, yeah, it includes being part of a TCO, but that's not all.
Right.
The memo specifically says that paying a TCO to be smuggled into the United States also counts as a nexus.
Well, hang on. Paying a smuggler.
Paying a smuggler, yes.
Let that sink in for a second. Think about how many people trying to cross the southern border are essentially forced to pay these criminal organizations just to make the journey.
Exactly. It's almost part of the process for many.
Like a toll.
Precisely. If we just take a step back and look at how migration across the U.S.-Mexico border often unfolds, it becomes pretty clear how wide this net could potentially be. These criminal groups have a significant hold over those routes.
So paying them is, unavoidable for a lot of folks.
For many individuals, paying them in some form is almost an unavoidable step in trying to cross. Now, the memo does make it clear that if someone just overstays their visa, comes legally and then stays too long, that's not going to land them in Guantanamo. So there's at least one clear line.
Okay, that's something, but you said there was more.
Yes, but then there's this other piece that feels a bit uncertain. It raises a really important point about migrants whose method of entry isn't clear-cut.
What do you mean?
The memo actually allows officials to assume.
Assume.
Yes, assume that a migrant paid a criminal group if they can't clearly explain how they crossed the border, and they happen to be from a country where that's like a common way for people to enter the U.S.
Okay, let's unpack that. So if someone arrives and maybe they're traumatized or just can't give a perfect step-by-step account of their journey,
Right.
and they're from, say, a country where cartels are known to be heavily involved in smuggling,
Yeah.
officials could just assume they paid someone? That feels like a pretty significant jump.
It really does. And Teresa Cardinal Brown, she used to work in U.S. immigration. She put it very plainly.
What did she say?
She said these rules could apply very broadly to almost any immigrant who came to the U.S. via the U.S.-Mexico border. Her point about how common it is to have to pay cartels in that region, whether directly or indirectly, it really highlights how many people this could potentially affect.
And she also raised a really crucial point, didn't she? Yeah. About assessment.
Yes. She raised concerns that there doesn't seem to be any individualized assessment of whether someone actually poses a threat before they could be sent to Guantanamo.
So it's less about whether this specific person is dangerous and More about the general circumstances of how they entered the country, which, as we've talked about, could be the reality for a lot of people just trying to get here.
Exactly. It seems to shift the focus from looking at each person individually to a broader way of categorizing people based on how they likely entered the country.
Hmm. And has the government confirmed this memo is real?
Yes, we did reach out, or rather, CBS News did, and the Department of Defense spokeswoman, Kingsley Wilson, confirmed the memo does exist.
Okay.
She described it as a way to clarify the roles of different agencies and, improve how they work together on this.
Which, on the surface, that sounds like standard government stuff, improving efficiency, coordination.
Standard procedure language.
But when you really look at what the memo outlines, it suggests a pretty big change in who could end up being detained at Guantanamo.
Yeah.
And it makes you think about whether this lines up with how things have been done before, right?
Absolutely. And this memo, this whole idea of using Guantanamo for migrants, it needs to be seen in context, doesn't it?
How so?
Well, think about other immigration actions taken. Remember when Venezuelans were deported to that mega prison in El Salvador?
Oh, right. Yeah, I remember that. The initial story was very specific.
Exactly. The initial story was that these were all criminals and gang members. That was the justification given.
Right. The narrative was very clear.
Hmm.
These are dangerous people being sent there. But then, wasn't there an investigation?
There was. 60 Minutes did an investigation, and it found that a really high percentage, like 75% of those deported Venezuelans, actually had no criminal record at all.
75%? Wow. That's a pretty big difference from what was initially suggested.
A huge difference. And so what's interesting to consider is whether we're seeing a similar kind of pattern here. The initial talk around Guantanamo was about holding the worst migrants, the most dangerous. But the actual rules in this memo seem to allow for a much, much wider group of people to be sent there.
So, okay, what do we actually know about how this Guantanamo operation is working in practice right now? We know the first group transferred were Venezuelans.
Right, and there were claims some had ties to the Tren de Aragua gang, but since then it sounds like it's been a bit more, well, sporadic and less clear.
Sporadic.
That's right. There have been reports of flights carrying migrants from different countries being sent to the base. However, there hasn't been a lot of detailed information released by the government about, say, exactly how much this is costing,
Right.
the specific criteria they're using day to day, or even how many people are involved overall. Transparency seems a bit limited.
And what has been reported is that both people classified as high threat and those deemed low risk have ended up there. That distinction seems really important.
It is.
You have individuals who are flagged as potentially dangerous, being held in the same location, maybe different parts, but the same base as people who are essentially just in the U.S. without authorization
Yeah.
and might not have any criminal history at all.
Exactly. And the government's own guidelines define high-threat detainees as those who have a history of violent or serious crimes, have engaged in disruptive behavior, or are alleged to have ties to gangs.
Okay, alleged ties to.
On the other hand, low-risk detainees are described as migrants who are facing deportation simply because they are in the U.S. without legal status and don't have a serious criminal record or sometimes any criminal record whatsoever.
So theoretically, someone who just crossed the border, paid a smuggler because they felt they had no choice, has no criminal past, they could be classified as low risk but still end up at Guantanamo.
Based on the memo's definition of nexus, that seems possible, yes. They'd be considered low risk, but still potentially eligible for transfer.
Okay. Speaking of where they're being held, what can you tell us about the facilities? Are they all in the same place?
Well, right now, the reports say there are currently 42 migrants being detained at Guantanamo. The memo and various reports indicate that the 32 classified as low risk are being held in the Migrant Operations Center.
Migrant Operations Center. What's that like?
It's described as a barrack-like facility. Apparently, in the past, it's been used to house asylum seekers who were intercepted at sea. So sort of basic group housing.
Okay. And the others, the high-threat ones?
The 10 individuals considered high threat are in Camp 6.
Camp 6. Isn't that part of the main prison?
Yes, that's part of the post-9/11 prison complex that also houses individuals suspected of terrorism.
Wow. Okay. So you have this situation where people picked up for immigration violations, some potentially with no criminal history, are being held on the same base as people suspected of terrorism, albeit in different compounds. That's a pretty striking image.
It is indeed.
And what does the memo tell us about who is actually responsible for these detainees day to day? Like who's legally in charge?
That's interesting, too. Legally, the migrants remain under the custody of Immigration and Customs Enforcement, ICE,
Even though they're at a military base.
even though they're at a military base, yeah. The Department of Homeland Security basically agreed that the conditions at both Camp 6 and the Migrant Operations Center are suitable for adult migrants.
Okay.
It's worth noting the memo specifically says that children would not be transferred to the base, adults only.
Right, okay. So ICE is legally in charge, but what about the actual operations? Who provides food, services, security?
The memo lays out how the responsibilities are divided. DHS, which oversees ICE, is responsible for providing things like recreation and religious services for the detainees. They also make decisions about their access to legal counsel, handle situations involving involuntary medical treatment, things like, if someone is on a hunger strike.
Right.
And they're in charge of the logistics of moving detainees in and out of Guantanamo. Apparently, they have a 180-day window from when a deportation order is finalized to relocate them.
180 days, okay. And what's the military's role in all of this then, if ICE is in charge?
The military's main job is to handle security, both within Camp 6 and around the perimeter of all the facilities.
Got it, security.
They also provide the hygiene facilities and medical care. That's for both the ICE personnel who are stationed there and for the detained migrants themselves. And the memo even mentions that there are unused tents on the base. Tents that lack basic utilities like plumbing or electricity. And these could potentially be used for future expansion if needed.
Unused tents without basic utilities. That doesn't sound like a very comfortable or, frankly, humane situation. It's probably not surprising that this whole thing is facing some pushback, right? Legal challenges.
Oh, absolutely. The ACLU has been very vocal in their opposition.
What are they saying?
Well, they've alleged that initially the migrants were held incommunicado, meaning, they couldn't communicate with their families or lawyers.
Oh, wow. Has that changed?
The administration has stated that they've taken steps to address the issue of legal access since then, but concerns about the conditions of detention remain.
Yeah, those tents.
Exactly. The ACLU has described the conditions as deplorable, and they've cited accounts from detainees themselves. There was one report of a detainee going on a hunger strike because he felt like he had been, in his words, kidnapped. Kidnapped. That paints a really concerning picture. And despite these legal challenges and the many questions surrounding the criteria and the conditions, it doesn't sound like the administration is planning to change course anytime soon.
No. Based on statements from Stephen Miller, who was, a key figure in shaping the previous administration's immigration policies, the use of Guantanamo for detaining migrants is expected to continue. He's been quoted as saying quite directly that there are no plans to stop and that Gitmo is open.
Gitmo is open.
Wow.
Pre-blunt.
So to kind of wrap it all up, it seems that the reality of who could be sent to Guantanamo for immigration violations is much broader than what was initially suggested, right?
Yeah, much broader.
The key criteria in this memo, especially this idea of a nexus to a transnational criminal organization, which again can be as simple as paying a smuggler, it really has the potential to include a large number of people who are seeking asylum or simply trying to enter the U.S. under difficult circumstances.
Exactly. It raises some really serious questions about fairness, about due process, and whether individuals are being assessed based on the actual danger they might pose, or simply based on how they arrived in the country, which, as we've discussed, is often dictated by very difficult, sometimes desperate circumstances on the ground.
Which brings us to that final thought for you listening. Considering the history and the original purpose of Guantanamo Bay, a facility created after 9/11 specifically to hold suspected terrorists, what does this expanded use for immigration detainees, including those who might not have any criminal record at all, really tell us about the current approach to border security and how migrants are being processed in the United States today? It's definitely something worth thinking about.